Stephanie, welcome to my channel. Today is going to be a series I hope to start on this channel. It's about me reading books from the early 2000s, so you don't have to. Early mid 2010s, I was a teenager and I read a lot. I read young adult, I read adult, I mostly read young adult. There were a few series from that time where I look back really fondly on them, but I don't know if they would still hold up today if I read them now. One, as an adult, and two, like in this day and age, and three, like me having the knowledge that I have now about the world and writing in general, like how these books would stand up to the test of time and would I consider them good right now. I'm really excited about this, and I'm also a little bit apprehensive too, because it's like I get to revisit stories that I really loved and I think will strike a lot of nostalgia in me, but also at the same time I don't want to read them now and then the story's ruined because I realised that maybe they're not that good of a book. I hope that's not the case. This is what I'm going to start out with, and it's a series I've actually been wanting to finish for a long time. The first book is Obsidian, and it's the Lux series by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This book was like my favourite book ever as a teenager. I think I read it maybe around 16, and this was literally the first book I ever read where I felt like, oh, I really want to read more of that author. Before then, I kind of just read books like willy-nilly, but it wasn't until I picked this up where I was like, no, I need to find more books of this author to read. I'm really disappointed in myself, and I know like my teenage self would be really disappointed that I haven't actually finished this series. There's 5 books in the series and I think I read the first 3, so there's still more to go. I don't remember anything from this. Like, I need to reread it to continue on the series. The other book I'm going to be reading for this episode for this video is Captive Prince by C.S. Pacat. This book was literally like, if anyone asked me what my favorite book was, it would be this. The Captive Prince trilogy was like peak for me. I just loved it so much. Like, I loved the romance, I loved the politics. I also felt like I was so grown up for liking this kind of story. I just felt it was so intellectual, all the themes and stuff in the book. Yeah, and I also loved the fact that it was an Australian author. Like, usually I was so used to a lot of the authors that I read being authors from the US or UK, somewhere else. So yeah, these are the 2 books I'm going to be reading. I'm going to give you my thoughts on each as I read them. So I also have some criteria of how I like the book. First is going to be like nostalgia, like how I loved them based on nostalgia. Does nostalgia carry me through enough to me liking it now still as well? So that's going to be one. I feel like it's a big impact on whether the story is good or not. I feel like you can read a story and it may not be objectively good, but the nostalgia that it brings to you because you've read it before or it reminds you of something, I think can really carry a story for someone. I think that's important to factor in. The second thing is going to be like the vibes of the book, because I feel like I rate books based on the vibes of it. Like the overall vibes, how it made me feel, how it makes me feel after I've read it. And then the third thing, which I think goes hand in hand with vibes when rating a book, is like whether it's objectively good or bad. As in, is the writing itself good? Is the storytelling itself good? Is it paced well? All the things that go along with rating whether a book is good or not. So the first book I'm starting on is this one. This is Obsidian by Jennifer L. Armentrout. First, I'll give a synopsis. There's a story about a girl named Katie. She ends up having these 2 neighbours, and they're brother and sister. They're twins. The sister immediately tries to befriend her, but then the brother is a complete pig to her. And then you soon learn, and also Katie soon learns, that these 2 siblings, they're both aliens. I remember there's like fighting and like paranormal aspects, like very 2010s. Girl finds out that boy has powers and a romance ensues. Very much that vibe. I lived for that vibe at the time. It was my favorite trope ever. I felt like I was the only one in the world who discovered it. It was like my own little secret that I read this amazing book, this amazing series, because there was no one in my life that read at the time. Like, I never talked about books with anyone. From what I do remember how I felt about it, I remember that I felt like the love interest was really hot. Teenage me felt that way. I felt like the paranormal aspect of this book was like something I'd never read before. I felt like it was a kind of unique in that way. There was so much story to unpack. Like, the first book kind of just scratched the surface of what there is to learn about this world. I felt like the plot twists were really cool. I could never expect what was going to happen in the plot. I was always surprised at everything that happened. I could never guess where the story was going to go. I definitely gave it 5 stars as a teenager. It was like I said, top like favorite series. the best. So yeah, it's been sitting on my shelf for years and years. I think I purchased it around the time those new covers of these books came out, which are these covers, and they're horrendous. There's so much you could do and how to make them pretty, and this is what they chose to change them to. I cannot understand for the life of me. Yeah, around that time I was like, oh my god, I gotta snap up the old books, otherwise I'm gonna be stuck with these new books. So I'm really, really, really looking forward to this. I will catch up with you whenever it's more of Obsidian. I got my notes ready. So I read Obsidian. I ended up reading it on my Kindle using my phone for this example. When I first started it, I was like, what is going on? The way the main character talked in her head, I just was like, oh, this is going to be excruciating because it just felt very juvenile. I think I made a comment, it felt very YA. I don't mean that in the sense of like putting down YA. I mean that in the sense of it seems like a young book. The writing seems very simplified, and I just get so frustrated when authors write this way because it's like, okay, maybe like 10-year-olds think like that, but 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds don't think like that. They're a lot more mature than you would expect and are a lot more capable of having complex thoughts and emotions than what some authors like put on their characters. So it started that way and I was like, this is going to be a bit painful. I did not remember it being this bad, but I was like, no, I must persevere. And thankfully that didn't last long. It maybe only lasted the first chapter or so, and then I got a bit better. There were moments here and there throughout the story where it kind of did slip into that like more immature voice, but I think like overall it was okay. It was a distant memory by the time I'd like completed the book. I have a lot of notes. There's a lot. This is just annotations that I've made as I've gone along. So it's basically about Katie. She moves into town and then her neighbor Dee ends up befriending her and basically is like, I want to be your best friend. She also has her twin brother, Damon, who is extremely overprotective and he acts like a complete asshole, even scary. And in the beginning, it's like actually disgusting. Like, I think she calls like, oh, he's just a bully. Like, no. Let me go to the spot. He literally backs her into a tree and then like crowds her as she's leaning against this tree and like fully gets up in her face and is like, if anything happens to my sister, you're going to be held responsible for it. And it's just like, what the fuck? Like, she's just this new person that's just moved into town. She's done absolutely nothing wrong. It's too much. It's like so too much. If it was me, I would always be like, okay, I don't want to get involved in that shit. Just leave me out of your family drama. Like, I don't want to be a part of it. So yeah, he kind of ends up cooling off a bit. he's still not nice. This whole time, the main character, Katie, she's always talking about how hot he is, how attracted she is to him. Like, that's fine, you can have that attraction, but if it was me, if I'm attracted to someone and they act like completely unhinged and scary, like that attraction's just gone. Doesn't matter how hot they are, means their personality is fucking rotten. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with them. So it was just kind of like, oh, really? Like, she's still into him, yet he's treated her like such a fucking piece of shit. It's just frustrating. And then like he ends up being like, okay, my sister's gonna be friends with her, I need to act nice kind of thing. And he does, but then he doesn't actually apologize for the way he acted. Doesn't even give any explanation, just nothing, just pretends it didn't happen and kind of goes on his merry way. So Damon and Dee, they're aliens that are made of light from some distant planet that got destroyed. And then there's also like the evil people, the Aram, which means like darkness or something in Latin. And like Luxon is like light. So the Aram are like evil and they try to find the Luxon and like absorb their abilities and kill them. Apparently when like the Luxon use their powers around humans, their light kind of gets absorbed by humans. And so they have this kind of like aura around them that shows the Aram and other Luxon that they've been around a Luxon that's used their powers. So it can kind of be an attraction to the bad guys, the Aram. Something happens and Katie ends up having this trace on her and she ends up getting attacked by an Aram. But then after the attack happens, Damon ends up saving her, but you don't realize that until later. He basically like frightens her into keeping quiet about it, like telling her not to talk to Dee about it, don't worry her about it, don't tell her there's an attacker running around outside and da da da, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, from the perspective of she has no idea about the aliens, about these evil people, and here's some random guy telling her not to tell her friend about the attack and stuff and her worries that there's still someone out there. And then also he was kind of blaming her for it, like that it was her own fault she got attacked, even though it literally is not her fault at all. It's actually his fault because he used his powers around her and she absorbed that aura thing. There was also a lot of verbiage in this book that was just like, oh, so painfully early 2000s. Like the phrase like awesome sauce was used a couple of times. Here it referenced something like, I wasn't sure if I should feel like a celebrity or an escaped mental patient. I don't know, that kind of shit. People just don't write like that anymore because it's offensive. And also the phrase toe bag was used, which I literally can't even remember the last time I've seen that written anywhere. Like, it's been a long fucking time. Maybe the last time I read this book. Also, I think this book in general, I think just wasn't edited well. It's sad to say that because there clearly was an editor, because Jennifer L. Armentrout thanks them in the acknowledgements. So I feel bad saying this, but the editor didn't do a good job. And I feel like that was actually common in books of this time because I remember picking up mistakes a lot when I read. I didn't even feel like I read that critically. So there's like a lot of sentence structuring and also just like the way things are written. Like this was one of the phrases, you sound like those things have something in common. Like if this was edited by a proper editor, like that sentence would not have made it. It would definitely be something else. Like you can kind of understand what they're trying to say, but it doesn't make any sense. There was also another sentence not long after. It said, the ground shivered under his sheer strength. I knew if I tried hard enough, I could reach down and feel it quake. Like, wouldn't she already have felt it because she's standing on it? And why did she have to try hard to feel it, like with her hands? But if you're standing, you could feel it. You could It just doesn't make sense. I'm sorry, like my editor brain is just like really annoyed when these things come up because that's like what you're taught as an editor to pick up on, not just like grammar and shit. There was this part in here that was so very much like early 2000s, I'm not like other girls kind of thing. And it was like the author talking about herself and the idea of the story. And because like the main character too, she has like a blog, and this was one of the sentences. Out of all the paranormal books I've read and reviewed, no one glowed like this. Some glittered in the light, others had wings. No one was a freaking giant sun. I'm just like, this sentence just screams, I'm not like other books. Like, I'm not like other YA stories. Like, I'm unique. No other story has boys that are bright as the sun. It was just funny to me. There was parts too where like Damon, the alien boy, was very possessive over her. Like it ended up being a shift to being like possessive of his sister to possessive of Katie. Of course course, because of why can't the guy be possessive? You know, that's just how it is. But it was good in the sense that it just showed the strength of Katie, because anytime he pulled that crap of being overprotective, telling her to do something, I feel like a lot of stories she would have just gone along with it. She actually like stood up for herself, didn't give in to his shit, which I really did actually like. She was shown as a really strong character and her own person outside of him and outside of him dictating what she should do. So I really liked that. And yeah, so it was nice because there's like a lot of things that happen throughout the story, but then by the end of it, Katie is like, I really like this guy, but I don't believe what he says to me because he treated me so badly in the beginning, which I really loved. I really, really loved that she stood up for herself and she was like, I'm not just going to give in to this guy because he's nice to me now. Like, she's like, no, you treated me like shit. I don't want to just get with you because now you suddenly like me because of these sudden events that have happened. Like, I think as the reader, you can kind of see like he acted that way because he was just afraid. So it's understandable the way he acted, but that doesn't make it right. And I like the fact that she understands these things, but still doesn't give in to his shit. So yeah, that's kind of the end of this book. Despite a lot of the bad things I have to say about this book, I liked the story itself. And yes, okay, maybe it is true. It is quite a unique story. Like, I've not read much like it. Like, I've read like it in the sense that it's a paranormal story about a boy with powers that a girl meets. But the events that carry out, like I said, I didn't expect them to happen the way they did. And then also the direction that the story takes. I also really liked that Katie, the main character, like stands up for herself. I think that's really, really cool. And I liked it so much that I ended up like immediately getting the second book and immediately reading the second book. Let's go back to that first list of what criteria. So it was like nostalgia, vibes, and whether it's objectively a good story. So first of all, nostalgia. There was a little bit of nostalgia, I think, because I didn't quite remember the story. I just kind of remembered the overall gist. I think that because I forgot so much that happened, I didn't feel specifically nostalgic. There was a scene that towards the end of the book where I remember so vividly in my brain. So anytime I thought of this story, like I thought of that scene, but I feel like I pictured it differently this time than I did the last time. But I think because there'd been so long since I've read it, I didn't feel like any of it was familiar, which was nice. The vibes itself, I did really enjoy it. I loved the power aspect, especially as you go into the second story, like how the story evolves. I do really enjoy that. I felt like it's like peak trope of what I like from a series where it's like this normal girl is brought into this fantastical thing. I felt like it was like a nice twist as to how they ended up bringing her into that world afterwards as well. The vibes itself, like, yes, he was a piece of shit, but I loved the fact that she stood up for herself and she supported her friends. Yeah, like stood up for what she believed in. I thought that was really, really cool. The whole lore of the world, of the aliens and all that kind of stuff, I really liked that as well. So vibes were pretty good. Whether it was objectively good or bad, I remember in the beginning I said that I felt like it was like the first book I read that I really, really wanted to read from the same author again. Since reading the book, I've realized it's not because I felt like it was amazing writing, because it's not. It's very basic writing and it's more like the storytelling aspect that's really good. The story itself, I think, is really good. The way it's structured, that kind of stuff. I think sometimes the character reactions are a little bit off, but there wasn't too much of that, which I was actually surprised. And also, like I said, it wasn't edited very well. So I think objectively the story and the writing itself, it's pretty basic. Maybe 3.5 kind of thing. Like, at least there was no continuity errors that I picked up, which was good. Vibes itself, like 4.5 stars for me. So I think like overall, it's like a 4-star read, I think. Me now saying it, like old me would have said 5 stars, amazing, pristine, nothing to be fixed. Me now, 4 stars, but that's more based on the vibes and less on the fact that it's like a really well written story. So yeah, overall, it doesn't stand up in every aspect, but the story itself, yes, it's pretty good. I would recommend this again, and I would say definitely still one of my favorite series. So yeah, that's Obsidian. And on to Captive Prince by C.S. Picard. Let's talk about the book. Actually, let's talk about the book. What I remember of the book and the vibes and everything. Okay. So nostalgia-wise, like I said, I love this book. It was one of my favorite books ever that I read, and I just loved the series. And I remember the first 2 books were out. I read the first 2 books. Third book hadn't come out yet, and I was so impatiently waiting for the third book to come out. I even pre-ordered it. The only book I've ever pre-ordered was that book. I was so impatient that I stayed up until the clock ticked over to the release date at 12 a.m. I purchased the book on ebook. And I read like half of it that night, and I forced myself to go to sleep, and then I woke up and I read it the next day as well, and I finished it before I got the physical copy. That's how much I loved that series. I've never ever since then pre-ordered a book or like gone out and purchased a book right on its release date. So that's kind of the nostalgia part of it. Vibes, I loved it. I loved the romance, and I loved how the romance progressed. I felt like in the beginning, because I knew it was a male-male romance, I felt like in the beginning, the way the story is set up, I was like, how is this going to happen? I feel like it might be a forced kind of romance thing for them to be together, because the way the characters start out is like about 2 princes. One is the prince of the current kingdom that you kind of start the story in, and then the other prince has been captured and stolen from his kingdom and is given to this new prince as like a slave. At the time, I didn't see any issue with it in terms of like the overall story, how he starts out as a slave to this guy and then they end up having a romance. But then like I saw someone talking about this story and about how it's quite toxic. If that happened in real life, that wouldn't be the type of romance that should happen. I don't know, I think I'm feeling apprehensive about approaching this book because of that. This is like another criteria to keep in mind. Like, I remember the vibes being like perfection in terms of like the political atmosphere and the tension and the stakes that it involves. Like, I just remember really enjoying it. Objectively good or bad, I actually remember this being objectively very good. Like I said, like I think I felt at that time I didn't read many stories with a lot of politics about a created world. So I felt like it was so groundbreaking for me when I read this story. I loved that, and I felt like the author did a really good job at making it very comprehensive that I could follow along, especially at that age. This is my bookmark to go with this book. I'm going to start this one and check back in with you soon. I'm back because I finished Captive Prince and I have a lot of thoughts on both of these. A lot. So this book, Captive Prince, I'm not sure if I recapped it earlier. I'm going to recap it now though. This is about Damon, who is a prince. I'm just sitting here editing right now. I'm so silly. I didn't even realize that both the main characters of these 2 books have the same name. They're spelt differently. In Obsidian, Damon is spelt this way, and then in Captive Prince, Damon is spelt this way, but they're the same name. How did I not realize that? Anyway, back to the video. Captive Prince is about a prince called Damon. He is the Prince of Achelos, and he's in line to be king very soon because his father's just passed away. Then he's like ambushed, and his brother decides to take over the throne from Damon and strips him of his identity and sends him off to a warring country called Via as a slave. Because in this world, like, slavery is very much a thing. Each country has its own type of slavery, I guess. So Damon's shipped off to this country, given as a gift to the prince. This is very dangerous for Damon if the prince found out, because this prince, Laurent, his older brother was killed by Damon like 6 years earlier, and Laurent hates his guts, like has been training his whole life to be able to come face to face with Damon and kill him. He's now been put in this position where he's a slave, but also there's the added layer of if he's found out to actually be Damon the prince, then he'll like definitely be killed. So he has to keep his identity a secret, all the while trying to escape. So he's given to the prince Laurent, like I told you. Laurent is not happy to have him around. As the story goes on, Damon learns that there's a lot of political things that are happening that can affect his own country as well. Damon ends up realizing he actually has to help Laurent become king of his own country as well, because the placeholder king for Laurent to become of age, he is actually a really evil person. So yeah, I ended up reading Captive Prince and immediately went into the next book in the series, Prince's Gambit, and then the next book, King's Rising. This series I just really, really love. I love the political intrigue. I love the world that's been created. I just enjoy so many aspects about this series. The political intrigue that carries on throughout this story, and it gets more intense in the second and third books. It's very clever and very thought out. Like, it doesn't feel obvious at all as a reader. I don't read like hugely complicated political books at all. So maybe it's just that can be a case too, but you can never really guess where it's going to go. There's a lot of layers to the alliances and like strategy and everything that's played in this book. It's really, really cool. I actually forgot everything that happened in this story. I don't know how, because this book was one that I considered to be my favorite for the longest time. I couldn't for the life remember what was actually going on. Like, some things would happen in the book and I'd be like, oh, what happens? What happens? Like, I couldn't even recall what actually happens. That's how long it's been that I've read this. So I felt like it was actually like the experience of me reading it for the first time almost, which was just so amazing to experience, because you know how you always think like, oh, I wish I read my favorite book for the first time again. I literally did. Yeah, like I mentioned, the writing itself, amazing, really great storytelling, a lot of clever storytelling I felt, in the sense that the plot wasn't predictable, in the sense that you never know where people's allegiances lie, and you never really have like a true sense of like the direction of the story. Like, there's often like a very twisty road to how they get to where you expect. Another part of this world that was really interesting was that the country that he was sent to via was actually a country where same-sex pairings was the default, and a relationship between a male and a female was pretty much not allowed unless you were actually doing it to make children. Especially in the royal family, like, you absolutely could not be a man and a woman alone in a room together, because it was considered something that was like illegal. You had to have a chaperone. Yeah, another thing that I wanted to mention was that like there are events in this book that happen that like do require trigger warnings for you to read. By the end of it, the characters want to resolve these things, which is something that's, to be honest, I feel like not seen that often in stories, especially fantasy, where those kinds of themes like racism and slavery exist. Like, a lot of the times it's something that just exists in the world and it's not necessarily fixed. The author writes in a way that it's not seen as something that's just like, oh, it's fine to do. It's like very much seen as something that's not okay. They wrote it with the intention to have it be something that's fixed within the world, to make this world like better in the future, and like how the characters got there to make that happen. And I think it's important to know that the author is also a person of color, so it's kind of like comes from that perspective where they are intentionally writing about race and the issues to do with race as well. I mean, I feel like I can't necessarily just talk about this, rather the series as a whole, because I think if you just read this story itself, those issues are very, very prevalent. Mainly in this first book. It was not originally split up into 3 books. It was actually written as one book. So I think to consider this story and those themes, you also have to consider the story as a whole, as it being an overarching arc. Anyway, in terms of like the nostalgia checkbox that I needed to consider for rereading this series. It was nostalgic in the sense that I knew that I had liked it in the past, but apart from that, like I said, because I didn't actually remember a lot about the story, it didn't necessarily feel like nostalgia reading it, if that makes any sense. It was not something where I felt like my judgment was clouded from being able to critique this book. Vibe was just like immaculate. Like, if you're okay with the trigger warnings, which for me personally, I can read most things. The only thing was, yes, there were things that did happen that I did feel was like really uncomfortable to read about and wasn't necessarily necessary for the story, and I felt like it could have been done without. It didn't really need to happen. Like, I understand why it was written in the context of the story to kind of like up the stakes and up the fear of the main character and make them realize like how dangerous the world is, but that didn't mean that I was like okay reading it or like okay that it was in there. The way it's written definitely holds up. Like, technically, writing wise, the storytelling is really great and the writing itself is really great. Like, C.S. Bacart is a really good writer. So yeah, this one I would definitely have to say still holds up. Let's go through the Kindle annotations. I feel like this book was very different to my read of Obsidian, because I feel like that a lot of the times I was highlighting things that I'm like, no, not liking that. Whereas this was more just like highlighting how much I enjoyed it. Yeah, so I looked at my annotations and it's pretty much just like of annotations of everything that I enjoyed about this book. There wasn't anything that I felt like didn't work with the story or like needed to improve, like not like Obsidian where like some of the language that was used was just like ridiculous. I definitely recommend people reading this if you like fantasy. Like, highly recommend reading this. I really recommend it for reading books from the early 2000s to see if they hold up. I feel like this book held up more. I don't know if that also could be because it's written for an adult audience, whereas this is written for a YA audience. Something like about this story that I touched on before is like the language that was used throughout, where the author would have the main characters say them this like really weird things like awesome sauce and things like that. But it could have also just been because it was a product of its time. Like, those can be specific to the author, but I think in general, like YA especially, I feel like you're always told that you need to be telling these stories with your audience in mind, and usually that comes along with a lot of slang that like younger people use. Now it might be different where it's seen more as dating a story if you get really stuck into slang, because also like slang now, it's like it transforms so quickly. There's such a high turnover of words that are used, and also like little phrases that people say that maybe even in a few months will be seen as dated. Yeah, anyway. So this book didn't really involve any of that stuff, which was, I think, good. But I think also that's just a product of it being fantasy, and those kinds of things don't exist necessarily in fantasy. Like, it depends, but yeah. Yeah, so these, as you saw, the books that I read for this video, they did hold up. They actually did hold up. This one, like, it held up in the sense that the storyline itself was good and something that I enjoyed. This book, I feel like it actually is like very much objectively a really good story. This one, it's more to do with if you specifically enjoy paranormal elements, if you specifically enjoy YA. With this one, I would recommend to a lot more people. I'm actually really looking forward to continuing this as like a series where I read books from my childhood and rate them now to see how they stand up. If you want to check out more content from me, you can check out my Instagram, which is linked down below. Please subscribe if you liked this video, and please check out some of my other videos if you would like to see more from me. Please let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these series and what you thought of them. If it was good or bad, I don't mind. I like hearing everyone's opinion, whether they're negative or positive about something that I like. I don't mind. I think it's just really interesting to see people's different perspectives. So thank you so much for watching. Bye.